The gunshot still echoed across the valley when Willa O'Malley buried her husband. Standing beside the fresh mound of earth with her 5-year-old son clutching her skirt, she felt the weight of Colorado's vast emptiness press down upon her shoulders. Lone Pine had never felt so desolate, even with its meager population of 200 souls scattered across the foothills of the Rockies. The year was 1876, and the West was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Patrick O'Malley had been taken not by outlaws or Indians as so many others were, but by a simple accident, his horse spooked by a rattlesnake, throwing him against a rock with such force that he never woke again. Such was the cruel simplicity of death in these parts. "Mama, is Papa with the angels now?" little Thomas asked, his voice small against the whisper of wind through the pines. Willa nodded, unable to find words as she stared at the wooden cross. At 26, she was now alone with a child, a small ranch, and debts that seemed to multiply like weeds after spring rain. The ranch hands had already begun drifting away, knowing she couldn't afford to keep them on. "Come, Thomas, we need to go home now." She took his small hand in hers, feeling its warmth against her cold fingers. The faces of the townspeople who had gathered for the burial were already turning away, their sympathy limited by their own struggles for survival. Reverend Miller approached her before she could leave, his Bible clutched to his chest. "Mrs. O'Malley, please know the church is here for you in your time of need." "Thank you, Reverend," she replied, knowing full well that the church's coffers were as empty as her own. "We'll manage somehow." Her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Patrick had left her with 20 acres, a modest herd of cattle, and a small house he'd built with his own hands. But the drought had been hard and the banknote was due in less than 3 months. Without help, she'd lose everything. The ride back to the ranch was silent except for Thomas's occasional sniffles. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for such a sorrowful day. As they approached the ranch house, Willa saw a lone figure sitting on their porch steps. Her hand instinctively tightened on the reins, and she pulled Thomas closer to her on the wagon seat. "Who's that, Mama?" Thomas whispered. "I'm not sure," she said, slowing the horses. In these parts, strangers were viewed with equal measures of curiosity and suspicion. As they drew closer, the figure stood a tall man with broad shoulders and a weathered face. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but even at a distance, Willa could see he wasn't an ordinary drifter. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to hard work and solitude. "Mrs. O'Malley," he called out, removing his hat as the wagon approached. "Who's asking?" Her voice was firm despite her exhaustion. She'd learned long ago that in the West, showing weakness was an invitation to disaster. "Isaac Reynolds, madam. I was a friend of your husband's from his days in the cavalry. I came as soon as I heard about Patrick." The man's eyes held a genuine sadness that made Willa believe him immediately. "You've come a long way for a funeral you've already missed, Mr. Reynolds," she said, climbing down from the wagon and helping Thomas down after her. "I've come to fulfill a promise, Mrs. O'Malley. Patrick once saved my life during a Comanche raid near Fort Griffin. I swore I'd repay the debt if ever the need arose." He cleared his throat. "I understand you might need help with the ranch." Willa studied him carefully. Isaac Reynolds stood about 6 feet tall, with dark brown hair streaked with early gray at the temples. His face was tanned and lined from years under the sun, but his eyes were clear and direct, a deep blue that reminded her of the mountain lakes. "Mr. Reynolds, I appreciate your sentiment, but I don't accept charity." "It's not charity, madam. It's a debt of honor. And I'm offering fair work for fair pay, though I don't require much in the way of wages. Just meals and a place to sleep would suffice until you get back on your feet." Thomas peered out from behind his mother's skirts. "Did you really know my pa?" Isaac knelt down to the boy's level. "I sure did, son. Your father was one of the finest men I ever knew, saved me and 4 other men during a blizzard back in '69. Willa hesitated. Every instinct told her to send this stranger on his way, but the reality of her situation was pressing down on her like an anvil. She couldn't manage the ranch alone, not with a young child to care for and not with her limited knowledge of cattle. "You can stay in the bunkhouse," she finally said. "We'll see how it goes for a week. After that, we'll talk again." Isaac nodded, picking up his saddlebags from the porch. "That's more than fair, Mrs. O'Malley." "Willa," she corrected him, surprising herself. "If you're going to be working here, you might as well use my name." "Willa," he repeated with a slight nod, "and I go by Isaac." That first night, Willa lay awake in her bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling and the unfamiliar knowledge that a stranger now slept in the bunkhouse just 50 yards away. Thomas had taken to Isaac almost immediately, peppering him with questions about his father that Willa couldn't bring herself to answer. The next morning arrived with the harsh clarity that often follows grief. Willa rose before dawn, as was her habit, only to find that Isaac had already been up for hours. When she stepped onto the porch with her coffee, she saw him mending the corral fence that had been broken for weeks. "You're up early," she called out, wrapping her shawl tighter against the morning chill. Isaac hammered the last nail into the rail before answering. "Always been that way, can't seem to sleep past first light. You don't have to start earning your keep quite so eagerly, Mr. Reynolds." "Isaac," he reminded her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "and I'm not much for sitting idle, thought I'd make myself useful." Over the following days, Isaac proved himself to be more than useful. He repaired the barn roof, doctored a sick calf back to health, and rode the fence line to check for breaks. He worked from sunup to sundown, stopping only to eat the meals Willa prepared. Even then, he ate quickly and said little, always eager to return to whatever task he had set for himself. Thomas followed Isaac around like a shadow, asking endless questions about horses, cattle, and the wider world beyond Lone Pine. To Willa's surprise, Isaac answered each question with patience, often taking the time to show the boy how to do small tasks appropriate for his age. One evening, about a week after Isaac's arrival, Willa found herself watching them from the kitchen window. Isaac was teaching Thomas how to whittle, his large hands guiding the boy's smaller ones with careful attention. There was something in the scene that made her heart ache, not with grief this time, but with a strange yearning she hadn't felt in a very long time. "He needs a man to look up to," came a voice behind her, making her jump. It was Martha Jenkins, the midwife who had come by with some preserved fruits and fresh bread. "Thomas?" Willa asked, though she knew exactly who Martha meant. The boy, yes, but I wasn't just talking about Thomas. Martha gave her a knowing look. "A woman alone out here faces a hard road. This Isaac seems decent enough." "He's just repaying a debt to Patrick," Willa said firmly, "and I'm not looking for another husband." Martha patted her hand. "Nobody said anything about husbands, dear. I'm just saying it's good to have help, whatever form it takes." That night at supper, Willa found herself studying Isaac as he ate. There was a quietness about him that seemed to run deeper than mere shyness. When he thought no one was watching, a profound sadness settled over his features. She recognized it because she saw the same expression in her own mirror each morning. "You never mentioned where you're from originally," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen over the table. Isaac looked up from his plate, seeming almost startled by the personal question. "Born in Missouri. Moved around a lot after the war. You fought," he nodded. "Union cavalry, met your husband afterward when we both signed on for frontier duty. And family, do you have people somewhere?" Something flickered across his face, a flash of pain so raw that Willa immediately regretted her question. "Had a wife and daughter once. Yellow fever took them both in '71 while I was stationed at Fort Davis." He said it simply, without embellishment, but the weight of those words filled the room. "Been riding solo ever since." Willa felt a surge of recognition. Here was someone who understood the hollow space grief carved inside you. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have pried. Nothing to be sorry for, it was a fair question." He turned to Thomas, who had been listening intently. "How about I show you how to lasso tomorrow, young man? Every proper rancher needs to know how." Thomas's face lit up, and the moment passed, but something had shifted between Willa and Isaac. A bridge of shared understanding had formed, fragile but real. The next few weeks passed in a rhythm that began to feel almost comfortable. Isaac proved to be knowledgeable about cattle and rangeland management, suggesting they rotate the herd to different pastures to conserve grass during the drought. He found a market for their calves that offered better prices than the local buyers Patrick had dealt with, and he worked alongside Willa to prepare for the fall roundup. As July gave way to August, Willa realized that the crushing anxiety that had followed Patrick's death had begun to recede. She still grieved, still missed her husband terribly, but the immediate fear of losing everything had abated. With Isaac's help, she might actually be able to meet the bank note when it came due. One evening, as Thomas was already asleep in his bed, Willa sat on the porch mending a shirt by the light of a lantern. Isaac approached from the bunkhouse, his footsteps deliberate as if giving her time to acknowledge his presence. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, hovering at the bottom step. "Please," she said, setting aside her mending. He sat on the step below her, leaning back against the railing. The night was warm, with a chorus of cicadas providing a constant backdrop to their silence. "I've been thinking about your situation," Isaac finally said, "with the bank note." Willa tensed. The deadline was just 3 weeks away, and though they had been setting aside every penny, she wasn't sure it would be enough. "I've got some savings," he continued. "Not much, but enough to help cover what you're short." "I can't accept that, Isaac. It's not a gift." "Consider it an investment in the ranch. You can pay me back when times are better." She looked at him in the dim lantern light, trying to understand his motivations. "Why would you do that? You've already done more than enough to repay any debt you owed Patrick." Isaac was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "Maybe I've found something here worth staying for," he finally said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. The implication hung in the air between them. Willa felt her heart beat faster, both in panic and in a strange, unexpected thrill. "Isaac, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving. I just wanted you to know that I'm not just passing through. If you'll have me stay, I'd like to be part of building something here." Willa didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to run inside to hide from the feelings his words had stirred. Another part, a part she barely recognized, wanted to reach out and take his hand. "I should turn in," she said instead, gathering her mending. "It's getting late." Isaac nodded, standing. "Good night, Willa." "Good night," she replied, pausing at the door, "and thank you for everything." After that night, something subtle changed between them. They continued to work side by side, but Willa found herself more aware of Isaac's presence, the sound of his voice, the way his hands moved as he worked, the rare smile that transformed his solemn face. She caught him watching her too, his gaze quickly shifting away when she noticed. The day the bank note was due, they rode into town together. Thomas stayed with Martha Jenkins, excited about the promise of fresh cookies and stories. The banker, Mr. Simmons, could barely hide his surprise when Willa counted out the full amount owed. "Well, Mrs. O'Malley, I must say I'm impressed," he said, writing out a receipt. "Many thought you'd have to sell after Patrick's passing." "Many were wrong," she replied simply. As they walked out of the bank, Willa felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in months. The threat that had been hanging over her head was gone, at least for now. On impulse, she took Isaac's arm as they walked down the main street of Lone Pine. "We should celebrate," she said. "A proper meal at the hotel restaurant." Isaac looked down at her hand on his arm, a smile spreading across his face. "I'd like that." The Prairie Rose Hotel was the finest establishment in Lone Pine, which wasn't saying much. But the dining room was clean, the food was good, and for the first time since Patrick's death, Willa allowed herself to enjoy a moment without guilt shadowing her pleasure. Over rabbit stew and fresh bread, They talked about the ranch, about the coming winter, and for the first time about themselves. Isaac spoke of growing up in a small Missouri town, of joining the Union Army at 18, of meeting his wife Clara at a town dance after the war. She had the brightest laugh, he said, a distant look in his eyes. Even when times were hard, she could find something to smile about. Our daughter, Emma, was just like her, 4 years old and already full of sunshine. Willa reached across the table and took his hand. They sound wonderful. They were. He turned his hand to clasp hers. I thought when I lost them that I'd never feel anything again except emptiness. For a long time that was true. I just moved from place to place, doing whatever work would keep me from thinking too much. What changed? She asked softly. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe nothing changes it, you just learn to carry it differently. He met her eyes. Finding purpose helps, having someone to care for. Willa knew he wasn't just talking about the ranch. The realization should have frightened her, but instead she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. I understand that, she said. After Patrick died, if I hadn't had Thomas depending on me, I might have just given up. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Willa O'Malley. They walked back to their wagon in comfortable silence, the late summer sun casting long shadows across the dusty street. As Isaac helped her up to the seat, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Willa felt the imprint of his touch even after he let go. The ride home was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the ranch, the setting sun illuminated the house and barn with a golden light that made everything look dreamlike and perfect. It's beautiful, Isaac said, almost to himself. It is, Willa agreed. Patrick and I came out here with nothing but dreams and determination. He built that house with his own hands, log by log. He created something worth preserving, something worth fighting for. That night, after they had picked up Thomas and settled him into bed, Willa stood on the porch looking up at the stars. She heard Isaac's footsteps behind her but didn't turn. Willa, he said, his voice hushed in the night air. She turned then, finding him much closer than she expected. In the moonlight, his face looked younger, the lines of worry and hardship softened. I should go back to the bunkhouse, he said, but he made no move to leave. Yes, you should, she whispered. Neither of them moved. The night seemed to hold its breath around them. I don't want to dishonor your grief, he finally said, or rush you into something you're not ready for. I know. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Isaac raised his hand to her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. When his thumb brushed across her lower lip, Willa closed her eyes, overwhelmed by sensations she had thought were lost to her forever. May I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Willa leaned forward, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them uncertain, both carrying the ghosts of their past loves. But then Isaac's arms went around her, drawing her closer, and the kiss deepened into something urgent and alive. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Willa rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart matching her own. I should go, Isaac said again, though his arms tightened around her rather than letting go. This time Willa nodded. Yes, Thomas might wake. Reluctantly, they separated. Isaac took a step back, then another, his eyes never leaving hers. Good night, Willa. Good night, Isaac. She watched him walk to the bunkhouse, his figure silhouetted against the starlit sky. Only when he disappeared inside did she touch her fingers to her lips, still feeling the imprint of his kiss. The following days were filled with a new tension, not unpleasant, but charged with anticipation and uncertainty. They worked together as before, but now their hands would brush when passing tools, their eyes would meet and hold for a beat too long, and conversations would trail off into loaded silences. Thomas, with a child's intuition, seemed to sense the change. One morning at breakfast, he looked up from his porridge and announced, I think Isaac should live in the house with us, not in the bunkhouse. Willa nearly choked on her coffee. Thomas, that's not. Mr. Reynolds is our employee. But he likes us and we like him, Thomas reasoned with impeccable child logic. And Pa's not using his side of the bed anymore. Isaac coughed, clearly fighting back a smile. Thomas, that's not how these things work. Your ma and I are friends and I work for her, that's all. The boy looked skeptical but returned to his breakfast without further comment. When Willa dared to look at Isaac, she found him watching her, his eyes warm with humor and something deeper that made her blush and look away. That afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, bringing the first real rain in weeks. Willa stood at the window watching the downpour, feeling grateful for the moisture even as she worried about the hay they'd left out to dry. A knock at the door startled her. Isaac stood on the porch, drenched to the skin, water streaming from his hat. "Sorry to bother you," he said, "but the bunkhouse roof is leaking something fierce. Is there a bucket I could borrow? Don't be ridiculous, you're soaked through. Come inside." She pulled him in by the arm, ignoring the puddle forming at his feet. "You need dry clothes before you catch your death." She found some of Patrick's old clothes in a chest, hesitating only briefly before handing them to Isaac. "These should fit well enough. You can change in the washroom." When he emerged, wearing Patrick's flannel shirt and trousers, Willa felt a strange jolt. It should have been jarring to see another man in her husband's clothes, but somehow it wasn't. The clothes looked right on Isaac, as if they belonged there. "Where's Thomas?" he asked, running a hand through his damp hair. "Napping. The rain always puts him to sleep." Willa poured 2 cups of coffee and gestured for Isaac to sit at the kitchen table. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rain drumming on the roof. Lightning flashed, followed by a crack of thunder that rattled the windows. "I've been thinking," Isaac said after a while, cradling his cup between his hands. "About what Thomas said this morning." Willa felt heat rise in her cheeks. Children say the most unexpected things. They do. But sometimes they see things more clearly than adults. He set his cup down and looked at her directly. "Willa, I know it's only been a few months since Patrick passed. I know you're still healing, but I want you to know that I care for you deeply. And for Thomas too." Willa's heart pounded in her chest. "Isaac, let me finish, please. I'm not asking for any promises. I'm just asking for a chance to be more than your employee. A chance to see if what I feel for you might someday be returned." The honesty in his eyes was almost painful to witness. Willa looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. "I do care for you," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the rain. "More than I expected to, more than I thought possible after Patrick, but it frightens me. The idea of opening myself up to that kind of loss again." "I understand fear, Willa. I've lived with it for years." Isaac reached across the table and took her hand. "But I've also learned that fear is a poor companion compared to love. Even knowing how it ended with Clara, I wouldn't trade our time together for anything." Willa looked at their joined hands as large and calloused, hers smaller but equally marked by hard work. "I need time, Isaac, to be sure." "Time is something I have plenty of," he said with a gentle smile. "I'm not going anywhere." The storm continued through the night, the rain sometimes easing to a gentle patter before returning to a driving downpour. Isaac stayed in the house, sleeping on a pallet by the fire rather than braving the leaking bunkhouse. Willa lay awake in her bed, listening to the rain and thinking about the man sleeping just a room away. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world and a spectacular rainbow arching over the eastern hills. Isaac and Thomas stood on the porch, pointing up at the colors while Willa watched them from the doorway. Her son's small hand was tucked confidently in Isaac's larger one, his face upturned in wonder. In that moment, seeing them together, Willa felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the tight band of grief that had encircled her heart since Patrick's death. It wasn't gone, would never be gone completely, but it had transformed into something she could carry without being crushed by its weight. Over the following weeks, as summer gave way to fall, Willa and Isaac settled into a new rhythm. He continued to sleep in the bunkhouse, but he took his meals with them in the house. In the evenings, he would read to Thomas from dog-eared adventure books, or teach Willa about the business side of ranching, things Patrick had always handled. Slowly, cautiously, they began to build something together that felt like family. The autumn cattle drive was a test of their newfound partnership. With the help of 2 hired hands from town, they moved the herd to market in the larger settlement of Carson Creek, 30 miles to the north. Thomas stayed with Martha Jenkins, proudly telling anyone who would listen that his mama and Isaac were doing business. The 4 days on the trail gave Willa and Isaac time alone together that they hadn't had before. Around the campfire at night, after the hired hands had turned in, they talked for hours. Isaac told her about his dreams before the war. He'd wanted to be a school teacher, and about the places he'd seen in his years of wandering. Willa shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis, her courtship with Patrick, and her initial terror at moving to the frontier. On their last night on the trail, with the lights of Carson Creek visible in the distance, Isaac finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. "You think you could ever love again, Willa? Not just care for someone, but really love them?" She looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and spark. "I think," she said slowly, "that love is not something we choose. It happens to us, sometimes when we least expect it or want it." She raised her eyes to his. "I think it might be happening to me now." The joy that spread across Isaac's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Without a word, he moved to her side of the fire and took her in his arms. This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no holding back. It was a promise, a beginning. They returned to Lone Pine with money in their pockets and hope in their hearts. Thomas was overjoyed to see them, chattering about his adventures with Martha and all the new words he'd learned. But that night, after he was asleep, Willa made a decision. She walked to the bunkhouse and knocked softly on the door. When Isaac opened it, surprise written across his face, she took his hand. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she said simply. He followed her back to the house without a word. In the privacy of her bedroom, their bedroom now, they discovered each other slowly, reverently. Their lovemaking was tender at first, then passionate, both of them rediscovering sensations long forgotten. Afterward, lying in each other's arms, Willa felt a peace she hadn't known in months. "I love you," Isaac whispered against her hair. "I think I've loved you since I first saw you coming home from Patrick's funeral, holding yourself so straight and proud despite your grief." Willa placed her hand over his heart, feeling its steady beat beneath her palm. "I love you too. I was afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I do." The next morning, they told Thomas together that Isaac would be living in the house with them from now on. The boy's response was a matter-of-fact nod, as if they were simply confirming what he had known all along. "Does this mean Isaac is my pa now?" he asked, looking between them with serious eyes. Willa knelt down to his level. "Isaac can never replace your father, Thomas. Your pa will always be your pa, and he loved you very much, but Isaac loves us too, and he's going to be part of our family now." Thomas considered this, then turned to Isaac. "Will you teach me to ride a real horse now, not just the pony?" Isaac ruffled the boy's hair. "When you're a bit bigger, I promise. For now, that pony is just the right size for you." That seemed to satisfy Thomas, who ran off to finish his chores, leaving the adults smiling after him. "Children are remarkably adaptable," Isaac observed. "Much more so than we give them credit for." "He's been asking for a father figure," Willa admitted. "I think he's been hoping for this." As autumn deepened into winter, the 3 of them settled into family life. Isaac moved his few possessions into the house, and together they prepared for the cold months ahead. They repaired the roof, stocked firewood, and preserved the last of the garden harvest. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Isaac carving wooden animals for Thomas while Willa knitted or mended. The first snow came in early November, transforming the ranch into a wonderland of white. Thomas was beside himself with excitement, begging to go sledding on the hill behind the house. Isaac fashioned a sled from an old barrel stave, and they spent the afternoon racing down the slope, their laughter echoing across the snow-covered valley. Watching them from the porch, wrapped in a warm shawl, Willa felt a happiness that was both familiar and new. It wasn't the same as what she'd had with Patrick. It shouldn't be, but it was genuine and deep. That evening, as Thomas slept exhausted from his day of play, Isaac and Willa sat close together on the sofa before the fire. "I have something to ask you," Isaac said, taking her hand in his. "Something I've been thinking about for a while now." Willa looked up at him, seeing the nervous anticipation in his eyes. "What is it?" "I know we've only known each other for a short time, though it feels like much longer, and I know that Patrick will always have a place in your heart." He took a deep breath. "But I love you, Willa O'Malley, and I want to build a life with you and Thomas. Will you marry me?" Though she had half expected the question, Willa found herself momentarily speechless. Marriage meant acknowledging fully that her life with Patrick was over, that she was choosing to begin anew. It was a final step she hadn't been sure she was ready to take, but looking at Isaac, at the hope and love shining in his eyes, at the strength and gentleness of his hands holding hers, she knew her answer. "Yes," she said, feeling the word release something inside her. "Yes, I'll marry you, Isaac Reynolds." His smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms. "I promise to be a good husband to you and a good father to Thomas. I can't replace what you've lost, but I'll spend every day trying to deserve the love you've given me." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Lone Pine. Martha Jenkins helped Willa remake her best dress, adding lace at the collar and cuffs to make it suitable for a bride. Thomas stood proudly at Isaac's side, holding the ring on a small cushion Martha had stitched for the occasion. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed her with such tenderness that Willa felt tears spring to her eyes. The winter passed in a contented blur of domestic life. Isaac proved to be a thoughtful husband and a patient stepfather. He taught Thomas to read better than the sporadic schooling in town had managed, and he showed Willa how to keep proper books for the ranch, a skill that would serve them well as their operation grew. By spring, Willa had news of her own to share. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the newly green hills with gold, she took Isaac's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said, watching his face for his reaction. For a moment, Isaac looked stunned, then a slow smile spread across his face. "A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for this new life. For our family." They told Thomas the next day. At first, he was confused, asking practical questions about where the baby would sleep and whether it would cry all the time like the Jenkins' new baby did. But gradually, he warmed to the idea of being a big brother, especially when Isaac assured him that his place in their hearts would never change. The summer of 1877 passed in a haze of heat and anticipation. Willa's body changed, growing round with new life, and Isaac watched the transformation with an almost reverent attention. He took on more of the physical work around the ranch, hiring 2 permanent hands to help with the expanding herd. The drought had broken and the land was recovering, growing lush with grass that promised a good year for cattle. In late September, just as the aspens were turning gold on the mountainsides, Willa went into labor. Martha Jenkins was called, and Isaac was banished to the porch where he paced for hours, jumping at every sound from inside the house. Thomas sat on the steps, watching his stepfather with wide eyes. "Is Mama going to be all right?" he asked, his voice small with worry. Isaac stopped his pacing to sit beside the boy, putting an arm around his shoulders. "Your Mama is the strongest woman I know. She's going to be just fine, and so is the baby. Martha's with her, and she's brought more babies into this world than anyone in the county." Just then, a cry pierced the evening air, the unmistakable wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Isaac froze, his heart hammering in his chest. A few minutes later, Martha appeared at the door, her face tired but beaming. "Congratulations, Mr. Reynolds. You have a healthy daughter." Isaac felt his legs go weak as he stood. "And Willa," tired but doing well. She's asking for you both." Thomas grabbed Isaac's hand, and together they entered the house. In the bedroom, Willa lay propped up on pillows, her face pale but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your daughter," she said softly as Isaac approached the bed, Thomas still clutching his hand. Isaac sat gently on the edge of the bed, hardly daring to breathe as Willa tilted the bundle toward him. A tiny face, red and wrinkled, with a tuft of dark hair, peered up at him. As he watched, the baby's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing a deep blue color that mirrored his own. "She's perfect," he whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "Absolutely perfect." Thomas climbed onto the bed for a better look. "She's awfully small," he observed. "What's her name?" Willa and Isaac exchanged a glance. They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one. "What do you think about Clara Emma Reynolds?" Willa suggested softly, watching Isaac's face. His eyes filled with tears at the mention of his first wife and daughter's names. "Are you sure?" Willa nodded. "They'll always be part of you, just as Patrick will always be part of me. Our past loves help shape who we are. They brought us to each other." Isaac leaned forward and kissed her gently, mindful of the baby between them. "Clara Emma Reynolds," he repeated. "It's beautiful, thank you." Thomas peered at his new sister with growing interest. "Can I hold her?" "If you're very careful," Willa said, showing him how to support the baby's head as she transferred the small bundle to his arms. The sight of his stepson holding his newborn daughter filled Isaac with a joy so intense it was almost painful. This family, this second chance at happiness, was more than he had ever dared to hope for after losing Clara and Emma. "I love you," he said to Willa, his voice rough with emotion. "All of you." Willa reached for his hand, squeezing it tight. "And we love you. You found us when we needed you most, Isaac, when I was drowning in grief and loneliness. We found each other," he corrected gently. "Two broken hearts that somehow fit together to make a whole." As the first stars appeared outside the window, the Reynolds family gathered on the bed, Thomas carefully holding his sister while Isaac's arm encircled Willa's shoulders. The ranch was quiet around them, the cattle settled for the night, the land peaceful under the rising moon. Lone Pine, Colorado, was still a hard place to make a living. The West remained as unpredictable and challenging as ever. But within the walls of their home, Willa and Isaac had created a sanctuary of love and understanding. Their shared experiences of loss had taught them the value of each moment together, and their shared loneliness had led them to find in each other the very thing they both needed most: someone who understood. As baby Clara drifted to sleep in her brother's careful embrace, Willa rested her head on Isaac's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. They had both known the deepest kind of grief, had both walked through the valley of shadow alone. But they had emerged together, bringing with them the memories of those they had lost and the hope of the future they would build. In the years that followed, the Reynolds ranch prospered. Thomas grew into a capable young man with his stepfather's quiet strength and his mother's determination. Clara Emma became a spirited girl who loved horses and brought laughter into every room she entered. Two more children joined the family, a boy they named Joseph Patrick, and another girl they called Margaret Rose. Isaac and Willa weathered the challenges of ranch life together: droughts and blizzards, market fluctuations and illness. They built a legacy out of love and hard work, creating something neither of them could have managed alone. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, they would often sit together on the porch, watching the stars appear over the mountains, their hands clasped together, no longer alone in their loneliness.